Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, welcome to our program again.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Well, there's some very interesting news this weekend. It's on an issue we talk about all the time on foreign policy to the Middle East. But most of us who follow this closely have heard about it, but I don't think the person that depends on regular TV has heard much about this. Matter of fact, it looks like a deliberate exclusion. And that has to do with the release of the Defense Intelligence Agency report of 2012. And Judicial Watch, which is a good organization, got the release of this. And although we had some suspicions of what was going on there, all of a sudden there is some confirmation. And I am quite sure that you have watched this carefully, and you might reveal a few of the things that was in this report.
Sure. Remember, this was an assessment taken just about a year after the U.S. actively began destabilizing the Syrian government. So the Defense Intelligence Agency, which, along with State Department's Intelligence and Resource Division, was actually very accurate in 2002 on Iraq. They did an assessment in 2012, and here are the three big takeaways from what was a heavily redacted report, but there was some still in it. The first being that the U.S. knew al-Qaeda was a key part of the Syrian opposition from the beginning. I remember we were told that these were moderate rebels, but the U.S. knew that al-Qaeda was key. The second was that the destabilization of Syria could result in the creation of an Islamic State in eastern Syria. And here's the quote from the report. This is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want. It said the supporting powers were the Western countries, the Gulf states, and Turkey. The third big takeaway, and this is interesting considering what's happened in the past week or so, the creation of an Islamic State in eastern Syria would have, quote, dire consequences and, quote, listen to this, create ideal atmosphere for al-Qaeda to return to Mosul and Ramadi.
See, for a while, we've been trying to sort this out. Are these people just really stupid? You know, we go over and they're supporting the wrong people, and the weapons end up in the hands of ISIS. And we say, well, they're either totally inept or stupid. But it turns out it's their strategy. You know, it's somewhat, very much like the strategy that was used in the 1980s when Brzezinski designed this thing that we're going to radicalize the Muslims, and which they did. The CIA radicalized Muslims in these madrasa schools. Hundreds of thousands of people went through these schools, and this is a continuation of this. So failure was actually their goal, and they weren't there to stop ISIS, but their goal, and you mentioned it, the main goal of all this activity was anti-Assad, anti-Russia part of that, anti-Iran. But more directly at this moment, it's anti-Assad, and there was a lot of factions that wanted to do this. Obviously, Israel was in favor of this. The Saudis in particular were in favor of this. The military-industrial complex was in favor of this. And, of course, the people who would like to get a pipeline to secure the West against the East, since this is an East-West fight, was to get a pipeline through Syria so that Europe would have no dependency on Russia. It's exactly opposite of how a market would work, and people who are free and getting along with people, things would work out quite differently. So this was a design, and it's tragic that it was. And so it isn't stupidity, it's a stupid policy, but it wasn't that they didn't know what they were thinking they could do.
Well, it seemed like they hoped they could create the emergence of an Islamic State type organization in Syria because they knew that's the only chance of overthrowing Assad. And of course, the implications are that he wasn't unpopular, so it wasn't a democratic uprising. So you had to do that, but they hoped it wouldn't spill into Iraq. And, a foreign policy based on hope like that doesn't seem awfully smart.
Well, I think we get a little bit more insight to John McCain because, what's McCain doing? I mean, doesn't he have a better understanding of this? He's going over and meets with these people. And we think he doesn't have good judgment. Of course, we know he's a militant interventionist, but we figured, well, why is he doing this? Because it's all backfiring. Oh yeah, I know him. I've met him. We'll just give the weapons to these moderates, and lo and behold, they go over into the radicals. Which, if he's an understanding what this report is telling us, he was doing exactly what he wanted to do, because their goal was to get rid of Assad and restore a very cold war with Russia.
And get back at Iran, isolate Iran is another big factor. But, you know, he was checking on his assets then is what he was doing by
That's
being
right.
there.
So, but it's the old East-West war going on right now, and we instead of taking the advantage of the breakdown of the Soviet system, which there were some improvements. I mean, we have been and still are to some degree trading, you know, with Russia, and there are investments, but our policy is bound and determined to push Russia toward China and India and further east. And I've often brought up the subject, well, that's exactly what we're doing financially too. And I think there's going to be a financial blowback, and I think there's going to be a blowback from this. You know, right now, ISIS is a blowback. I mean, all the killing going on, but it's used very effectively, you know, in the public relations here, the propaganda. Mm-hmm. It's easy to stir up the hatred and determination, and people were pretty sick and tired of our wars over there. But every single day it shifted. That's why it's a shame that this information doesn't get out. And I don't know, I can't find anything on the major media where they've spent any time on this, because in a way they just sort of march on with their propaganda, ignore this whole thing that they were doing.
Well, they want to ignore it, but the big takeaway that I had from this information is that the Western governments used the mainstream media to put forth this information that there are moderate Syrian rebels that we're supporting, that it's a democratic movement, that these are liberals, these are good guys, when they knew all along that it was untrue, and they still passed it through the mainstream media, which reported it uncritically, just like they did in the run-up to the Iraq War. So I think the question that you had, why is the mainstream media not reporting on this? Because it just shows how much they are in bed with governments to push propaganda.
You know, how long are the American people going to buy into this argument that we're defending freedom, defending the Constitution, and we are an exceptional nation, and our real goal is to spread democracy? You know, democracy, when we use our CIA to fix elections, democracy, when we conspire with our avowed enemies to overthrow one guy that we don't like, and if we just ignored him, like if we'd have just ignored Saddam Hussein, the world would probably be better off right now. But, you know, it gets so silly when you get almost all the presidential candidates saying, oh yeah, we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have done this because it was a mistake, you know, mm-hmm. And yet they were supporters of the war. So they are bought into this, but the real fault is that we have such a small voice. I hope we get a better voice because so many people agree with this issue. And they're channeled, you know, through the media into believing that there will be need for troops. And you see it every single day, whether it's on CNN or Fox or MSNBC. How can we do this? And we just can't let this happen. We have a moral responsibility because we are the only superpower and they're evil out there, except for the fact they're financing them.
Yeah. The one thing we know that they're not learning anything from this report because, as we heard in the news today, the U.S. and Turkey have agreed in principle to establish a no-fly zone over Syria. And that most likely will require U.S. troops to be on the ground illegally in Syria. It also means literally a state of war, and it also means that there'll be a lot more bombing and killing, and finally it means that the Syrian Air Force, which has been bombing ISIS, will no longer be allowed to fly.
That's right, and the bombing is not going to satisfy the hawks. They're going to want the troops, and the military guy on CNN said, well, he knows he needs 500,000, to be a real military force and do something, and they still might lose like they did in Vietnam. He said, oh no, we need a couple thousand here and take this town, and we'll shift them over here and we'll take this other town. And then all of a sudden they're very frustrated, and they say, Secretary Carter comes out and says, oh, can you imagine it? The Iraqis don't want to fight. Well, maybe they're sick and tired of fighting, and maybe they see the people that are fighting against the invaders represent their views more so. But this whole idea they wouldn't fight, that should be a powerful message. And why, one thing which is so sad, but it sort of is a good thing that's coming on, because these presidential candidates are saying, even though they were all hawks, they say, it was a mistake. We wouldn't have done it this way. What about a guy that's been sent over there and lost a leg and people that he knew died, and they're saying, well, we've been deceived by this, and this whole thing continues.
Dr. Paul, today is Memorial Day, where we're supposed to honor the veterans, and how does this honor the veterans to?
Well, it doesn't, and I mentioned the fact that to me one of the saddest things is that the propaganda says that we send our kids over there to risk their lives, and lose their limbs because they're protecting our Constitution in an unconstitutional war. We're protecting our liberties as the NSA destroys our liberty, and it's so little to celebrate. But this had come up in the presidential campaign. It's very difficult to say, well, in a truly free society and non-interventionist foreign policy, none of these deaths would have occurred, none of these injuries would occur, and it would be quite a different, because you cannot be insensitive, and I'm not. I claim that we who think that a different policy could have saved their lives are much more intense in our concern for the military than those who say, oh, this is an honorable thing, and it's why Memorial Day is just great. We have to praise them and thank you for your service. That's a cop-out. They're hiding behind that. They're using propaganda for themselves to make sure that they don't feel responsible, because I think they're sincere, but I think they're sincerely misled. So to me, that's a rather sad story, and I think Memorial Day ought to be a day when we remember some of our heroes. Matter of fact, I'm still on the side of Edward Snowden, considering him a hero. Daniel Ellsberg, got a lot of bad press and almost went to prison.
John Kiriakou, who did go to prison.
Went to prison, and there are so many out there that we don't even hear about that risk their lives. So, but only those who are able to kill a lot of people in a war that makes no sense. So it's tragic. So this is why it's easier for me to argue the case strategically, on principle of liberty, the principle of the rule of law, and saying that we shouldn't ever use aggression against our neighbors, whether it's our individual neighbor or our neighbor countries or in Europe. There's a great statement by Jefferson about just stay out of Europe and keep Europe out of the United States, and the whole world would be a lot better off. But anyway, I want to thank all the viewers for tuning in today, and please come back soon to the Liberty Report.